Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 82. Tony. Svartalfheim. Part 2. Asgard's throne room had been huge and apparently gold-plated. Mostly in Tony's judgment on the gaudy and somewhat impractical side of impressive. The dwarves' throne room. Yeah, this was what a throne room should be. It was long. About 25 yards long. It was also comparatively narrow, only about 25 feet wide. There were no support posts or partial walls anywhere for invaders to use as cover. More importantly, there was a second level to the throne room. All around the edges, there was a narrow-looking walkway with a stone and metal wall along its edge. And on that narrow walkway were at least 50 dwarves armed with bows and arrows, and Tony imagined a lot of throwable weapons that he couldn't see. An invader would be lucky to make it halfway to the throne at the far side of the room before they were killed. Provided, of course, they made it as far as the throne room at all. What was really cool, though, was that the dwarves hadn't forsaken form for function. The walls were covered in intricate murals done in jewels and metal. The designs reminded Tony a lot of Van Gogh's work, as there were a lot of very thin threads of metal doing swirls and loops to define whatever shapes were required. About halfway down the room, Tony had to pick his jaw up off the floor because the murals changed. The metal threads and jewels moved into different configurations until a new mural scene was in place. It was the coolest thing Tony had ever seen when it came to art. Thorgina reminded Tony just a little of Thorin from the movies. Black hair shot through with silver, short but full beard, and dark watchful eyes. Didn't look like him other than that, but yeah, Thorgin was dressed in some surprisingly practical-looking clothes for someone on a throne. A sky blue shirt, a pair of pants that came as close as to blue jeans, again in a pale blue, and sturdy leather boots. His crown was actually a circlet, sturdy but small and not likely to hamper movement. His only apparent nods to his own protection were a silver-colored breastplate and what looked like Mjolnir sitting on the floor next to him. Tony was guessing the big hammer was the dwarf version of Gungnir. Frigga had mentioned every realm had such a thing. Neither Loki nor Thor had mentioned the subject, but it made sense that a tool would be the dwarves' kingmaker. A big point in the dwarves' favor, not that they needed more, was that there were actually two thrones on the small dais. Thorgin sat in one, and his wife sat in the other. Tony couldn't help but like her a little because she was wearing a fire engine red shirt with a gold-colored breastplate. Disappointingly, she was wearing black pants and boots. She had the sort of light brown hair that people argued over it being brown or dark blonde, and eyes the same color as Heimdall's, which Tony had noticed because eyes like that didn't happen with humans and Heimdall never blinked, so it had freaked him out a little. When they got within about 20 feet of the dais, Thorgin got to his feet with a broad grin. Tony noticed that the dais, which was only one step up off the floor, put Thorgin right at eye-to-eye height with him.
Brunstalke, you are both most welcome. Introduce us to your companions.
King Thorgin, Queen Alvi. This is Steve Rogers, one of Midgard's defenders and the leader of their premier company. This is Soldier, a compatriot of Stephen's who was recently very ill-used and is currently recovering.
Thor said, then motioned to Tony.
And this is Anthony Stork, another of Midgard's defenders and an artificer of great skill.
That got Tony a keen assessing look from Thorgin.
Is that so?
Tony just grinned. I'm so far ahead of everyone else on Midgard, it'll take them a good 50 years to catch up to me, he said, which wasn't even a lie. Thorgin didn't quite look like he was buying it, but that could very easily have been an act.
What shall I say?
He turned and held a hand out to his wife in a gesture that was very much not all about public showmanship. Oh, there was some of that going on, but it was pretty clear that Thorgin wasn't shy about showing his regard for his wife, even when dealing with strangers. I would make known to you my wife, Queen Alvi, he said. Tony gave her the courtliest bow he could manage. He did not know how to do that sort of thing, after all. He just didn't generally bother because he usually had better things to do. Many better things. Your Majesties. Steve bowed as well, a touch more stiffly. Tony had a feeling that was more because Steve was unsure of himself than any other reason. Soldier, rather predictably, never even flinched. Then Thorgin spotted Mjolnir and about blew his top.
What is this? Who has dared to place enchantments?
Thorgin sputtered. Thor looked a bit sheepish, which was apparently all Thorgin needed to put two and two together.
Your father, was it not? We were a bit confused when he was dumped on our doorstep. After Frigga came and explained what had happened. Well, he was taken to the southern gold mines and put to work.
Tony nearly had to bite his tongue bloody to keep from laughing. Loki was nearly cross-eyed, trying to keep a straight face too. Steve and Thor both looked like they wanted to laugh, but weren't sure it was politic to do so.
I will go so far as to admit that perhaps an enchantment ensuring only the worthy can wield Mjolnir might be wise. Her power is immense. That said, it might be wise to alter the measure by which worthiness is judged. I dislike the idea of worthiness being judged by Odin Borson's measures,
Thorgin said.
Fortunately, as he is no longer king of Asgard, the enchantment he placed can be altered, if holded by another king.
Thorgin patted the dais.
Place her here, Prince Thor.
Thor did so after a moment's hesitation. Thorgin put both hands on the hammer and started muttering under his breath, quietly enough that Tony couldn't hear what he was saying. Blue-white lances of light, not unlike lightning, began dancing over Mjolnir and Thorgin's hands. After a few moments, Thorgin lifted his hands and stood back up.
There, it is done. Mjolnir will now choose for herself who is worthy.
The question Tony wanted to ask must have been written all over his face because Thorgin focused on him.
Magical weapons all have at least some small measure of a will of their own. Mjolnir being one of the most powerful and sophisticated magical weapons, approaches true sapience and thus has the capacity to judge whether or not a potential wielder would use her for ill ends or no.
Fair enough, Tony said. Then, because he could not resist it, since we're showing off, with your permission, Your Majesty, I'd like to show you something. He glanced up at the guards overhead. It may be a bit startling, but it is not a threat to you or your queen. Thorgin cocked his head, then nodded.
Very well.
Tony set the suitcase on the ground and kicked it into action, but not around him. Fortunately, he'd made it so the thing would fold out without having to wrap around a person for the purpose of maintenance and repair. Thorgin's eyebrows headed for his hairline as he watched the suit unfold. When it stopped moving, he walked a circle around it.
And Dragon, I assume that normally it wraps around the person.
He asked. Yeah, this mode is so I can check it for needed repairs and that sort of thing.
What is the function of these circles on the palms?
Thorgin wanted to know. They've got two functions, actually. The suit is flight capable, and the circles in the palms are flight stabilizers. They can also act as weapons.
The force needed to keep a man in a suit in the air would be suitable to at least knock an enemy down.
Thorgin agreed. Tony had seen the look Thorgin was wearing in his own reflection more times than he could count. It was his, this is awesome. I want to know more so I can do it better. Look.
This empty circle in the chest,
Thorgin asked. Blaze for a power source, Tony said, which was all they were going to get because, yeah, Tony was not getting into that. Want to take a peek at that helmet? It won't close properly, I don't think, but you can still see plenty. And there went the kid in the candy store. Look, Tony fought down a triumphant grin as Thorgin handed his circuit to Alvdi without a word. Tony pulled the helmet off the suit and offered it to Thorgin. The helmet didn't fit. Thorgin might be shorter than Tony, but he was wider, including his head. Still, despite the fact the helmet couldn't close properly, the HUD would still work. He couldn't quite stop the delighted snicker as Thorgin spent a couple of minutes alternating between "what?" and "oh, I get it," as he tried to figure the HUD out, sounding more and more excited all the while. Eventually, Thorgin took the helmet back off and handed it to Tony, dark eyes dancing as he settled his circlet back on his head after Aldvi handed it back to him.
I begin to think that Prince Thor was not mistaken as to your skills, Anthony Stark.
Thorgin said, a definite note of respect in his tone. Tony gave him a teethy grin. Wait until you see it in action, Your Majesty, he said, and call me Tony. He put the helmet back with the suit and kicked it back down to suitcase form. Thorgin
Thorgin nodded. As you will. Not Frigga mentioned that Midgard has need of a space fleet to help protect your realm against that madman Thanos.
Yeah, Tony agreed. I got a few ideas that way, but Midgard hasn't quite gotten to spaceships on that level yet. We've been in space plenty. We even have a space station. But we're still working at the finer points of space travel.
Truly, Midgardians have been in space. That is quite a feat. As I recall, Midgardians have been around for roughly 6 million years.
In one form or another, yes, true civilization, rather than hunter-gatherer tribes living hand-to-mouth, has been around for roughly 200,000, Tony said. Thorgin actually whistled.
Even 6 million years to go from first civilization to space flight in any capacity is extraordinary. I believe the fastest to evolve to that stage were the elves, at 5 million. At that, the space exploration came after their magic became so strong. It allowed them a few shortcuts the other realms didn't have. The other realms all took anywhere from 8 million years to 12 to begin space flight. That Midgardians have managed it in 200,000 years.
Thorgin shook his head.
Truly impressive.
Thorgin waved a hand, rather clearly dismissing the subject, somewhat to Tony's regret. He kind of wondered what made the difference between humans and the other realm residents that they'd gotten so far so fast.
Since you do not yet have a fleet of your own, I think perhaps it is best to show you the possibilities, so that you can have some idea of what you will want to ask for.
Then Thorgin grinned at Tony.
Besides, you and your people have no idea what dwarves can really do. Now come, this will involve a bit of a trip. I could show you schematics, of course, but really, showing you the real thing is so much better. And more fun besides.
Tony perked up. Oh, they were going to get to see one of the dwarf ships? That promised to be awesome. He picked up the suitcase again, and the lot of them trooped out of the throne room, back across the bridge that was apparently the sole access to the throne room, up 6 flights of stairs, and across another bridge to another heavily defended room with big white dots on the floor. Big enough for even Hulk to stand in comfortably. Right, Tony realized. Transportation room. Given that Tony had seen Loki teleport, he was betting this was the same sort of deal, just between set points. One of the dwarves guarding the room fiddled with something on the wall, and the world went white! When Tony was able to blink the spots out of his eyes enough to see, his first concern was Soldier, who hadn't exactly responded well to the Bifrost trips. He'd been better the second go-round, but he'd still been rather wide-eyed and had a death grip on Steve. Yep, wild-eyed and clingy, but Steve seemed to be handling it. Tony glanced around them. They were in a room a good deal smaller than the one they just left, with just 2 white circles on the floor. Tony decided he was not going to try to figure out how, in the name of hell, they'd gone from each standing in their own circle to standing in 2 groups like that. Magic. It was cool, but it also drove him batty.
This is my personal craft,
Thorgin said.
It is usually kept on Svartalfheim, so I thought it would be best to give you a proper tour with.
He did show them around, and Tony rather liked the little ship. Like everything else to do with dwarves, it was built with optimum function in mind, but didn't sacrifice form entirely in the process. There were lots of curves and rounded edges, and from Thorgin's explanations of which panels of buttons did what, laid out very practically. And the view screen on the bridge made his geeky little heart trip. The bridge made his geeky little heart trip full stop. Bridge! I'm a spaceship! Tony very deliberately didn't look at the others. He had a bad feeling they were laughing their butts off at his attempts to not visibly geek out too much. Then they got out into space, and anything even remotely resembling dignity and decorum got shoved at the nearest airlock, because in all his geeking out about the dwarves and their stuff, there was something that had escaped Tony's mind. The dwarves had an enormous space fleet, far larger than any other realms. Where do you park such things when they're not in use? The dwarves had a, I kid you not, space dock.